Assalamu alaikum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us to be here tonight. We thank Salam for having given us the opportunity to speak with you. And as we begin, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. Dear brothers and sisters, I openly bear witness that there is no God but the one God, Allah, and I openly bear witness that Muhammad, to whom the Quran was revealed, is his slave servant and apostle. Assalamu alaikum. As we seek Allah's help and his forgiveness, we seek refuge from the evil of our own souls and from our own bad deeds. Whomsoever Allah guides will never be led astray, and whomsoever Allah leaves astray, no one can guide. Dear brothers and sisters, I am of mixed heart about our message that this is Black History Month. This is the history of Islam among all of us in reality in this country. And so when I talk about the history, I'm going to refer not just to people of color, but we are all people of color, so I guess I am going to be talking about people of color. The reason that I wanted to start with that is because I am resentful of the fact that we call a month Black History Month, when in reality our history exists every day of our lives, because every day of our lives, from wherever we come and from whatever history we have to face that history each day, and we have to face how people deal with us based upon our history. So when we talk about the history of Islam in America, yes, there is a history of Islam involving people of color, but it is integrated with the history of Islam involving every one of us in this room in terms of our ethnic background. So I discovered a man that I had never heard of as I was doing some research on the history of Al-Islam. This is a brother named Sati, and he called himself the Imam of North America, and he was very responsible for setting up Islamic organizations back in the early 1900s. And the reason that he is so critical is because he influenced a lot of people of color in their development of their religious relationship to Islam. Noble Drew Ali was one of the people that he influenced. One of the other people that he talked to was Marcus Garvey. And so these are people that we have to talk about when we are talking about the situation of African Americans who have become Muslim and what influenced them. Now, Brother Sati went so far in his relationship with Noble Drew Ali to go back to the Mideast to get a fatwa against the brother, because Noble Drew Ali called himself a prophet. And he got a fatwa, but it was just the very fact that these are people that influenced Al-Islam from the beginning. There was a Sudanese Egyptian Muslim, Deuce Ali, who was an influence on Marcus Garvey and other people of that time period. Now let us give a context to all of this. African Americans were introduced to Islam before America existed. Many of the people who were brought over here as slaves were Muslims. And many of them continued to try and practice their religion even in slavery. The great reawakening to a more diverse group occurred in the early part of the 20th century. And there were certain people who were critical in that. Noble Drew Ali, who was influenced by these two people I previously mentioned. It's funny, Drew Ali, who was from Egypt, was dark-skinned, but to make sure people didn't think he was African American, he would always wear a fez to distinguish himself from people of African American heritage. Now, why was that critical? Because the perception of African Americans was still colored by the experience of slavery. Even though slavery had been outlawed for 50 years, it was not outlawed in practice. The whole issue of segregation and racial discrimination was openly practiced and was practiced openly up until the 60s. So he went among African Americans teaching about Islam and influencing Islam. Out of his work came the Moorish Science Temple of America. We also have at the same time the United Negro Improvement Association with Marcus Garvey. And at the same time, we have a lot of non-African American Muslims who finally began to manifest themselves in this country, resulting in the building of the first mosque in Maine and an Islamic association in 1919. Now, one of the ironic things that also happened at this time is there was a growth of Islam in the Midwest. And what most people don't realize is the reason that there are so many mosques in the Midwest is because during the early part of the 20th century, many of the immigrants who came to this country were farmers. And so when they came to America, they didn't settle in the cities, they went to the farms. And so you have mosques being established in cities like Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and places of that nature. It's why you also see huge influences of Muslims in states like Indiana. But that was another outgrowth of the growth and development of Islam that was outside of the African American community. Now let's talk about the African American community. Many of the African American communities were educated by people who came from the Ahmadiyya movement, as well as some Sunnis, but mostly the Ahmadiyyas were ones that reached out to the African American communities. And when they reached out and converted many African Americans to their faith. If you look, African Americans established their first mosque in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This was in 1926. And why is that important? These were not members of the Nation of Islam. These were people who were Sunni Muslims trying to follow their faith. Now, the Nation of Islam in 1933 was established by a man called W.D. Fard, or Wallace Fard. Now, we are not sure exactly what his ethnic background was, but many people say he was a rebel from the Ahmadiyya movement. And the reason that he is said to be a rebel from the Ahmadiyya movement is because he saw racism and the oppression of black people as one of the critical things that had to be addressed in trying to bring Islam to America, and especially to African Americans. So his formulation was very interesting. At the time, white people considered black people innately bad. There's no good black person. So he reversed it. And he said there's no good white person. He said even the babies are bad. He says when they're born, they're devils. And he said black men are really gods. And you know, now in the 1930s, when for me to stand up like this was actually a temptation to be oppressed and beaten, if not killed, this was shocking. Because as I tell everybody, you know, I grew up in an era of eyeball rape. Eyeball rape was when if you walked down the street and didn't have your head down and you looked white people in the eye, you could be accused of being too uppity. Now everyone in here is going, what are you talking about? This was a reality that African Americans had to live with, and many of you have heard the story of Emmett Till, right? Emmett Till was a young black man from Chicago who was accused of looking at and flirting with a white woman and ended up being killed. Many years later, the white woman recanted everything she'd said that he had done, but he was already dead. Now, the reason that I point that out is because racism creates a mindset that is irrational. It's irrational to think that one people is absolutely evil and another people is absolutely good. But that's what racism had done in this country. And so when W.D. Fard introduced Islam to the Muslims, he said that the black man is God and the white man is the devil. Whoa! That blew everybody's mind. Matter of fact, people were even scared to repeat the mantra because they were afraid that they would be oppressed. But the movement grew. The movement grew very slowly until World War II. Now, I should point out something. During the 1920s, America did something, I don't know if it was mentioned in the last talk. America bombed an American city. The U.S. Army bombed a United States city. It was in Oklahoma City. And there was a black community there that was bombed by the Army because the Army thought they were in revolt. Now, why do I point that out? The reason they thought that they were in revolt is because a lot of the soldiers who came back from World War I who were black had been taken to Europe to fight. And in Europe, they were treated like men. They even associated with white people who treated them as equals. And so when they came home to the country they had fought and died for and were told that they were less than men and should not expect to be treated like men, many of them didn't behave according to the rules of that time, and they demanded their rights. When they demanded their rights, they were killed. And if a lot of them got together, they would wipe out the community that they lived in to keep them in their place. So this led to a lot of resentment And that's why a lot of these movements started around the 20s and 30s. You know, many times when we look at African American history, we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, which is the time when Harlem in New York City was undergoing, you know, a real flowering of writing, art, literature, everything. But the rest of the country was not. The rest of the country was oppressed. So the growth of the Nation of Islam was influenced by this oppression. Now, in World War II, Elijah Muhammad was incarcerated because he refused to serve. He said he was a conscientious objector, and they put him in jail. And while he was in jail, he recruited people and began to develop a philosophy of self-sufficiency. You know, one of the mottos of the Nation of Islam was, you need to be self-sufficient and independent of the white man and build your own society. And this appealed to a lot of people, and it started to grow the community known as the Nation of Islam. Now, what really sent the Nation of Islam into fast growth was the attraction of a man called Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, or Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a dynamic speaker. He was asked to speak on campuses, in churches, in cities all around the United States, and basically grew the Nation of Islam from a small community of 50 or 60,000 to a community of over 200,000. During the time that it was growing, they established the Nation of Islam, University of Islam schools, where our children were educated by our family of believers. And in those schools, the children flourished. Again, the point is that the underlying philosophy was still the white man is the devil, the black man is God, but it built self-confidence and it built basically accountability into our children that allowed them to flourish. In 1962, the Nation of Islam launched the Muhammad Speaks, which is still one of the largest black newspapers in the United States. It grew to 800,000 readers at one point and became the largest black newspaper in the country. As it was growing, it began to preach a message of self-sufficiency and a message of separation. The Nation of Islam demanded that the southern states be ceded to African Americans and all the white people move out. It was something that attracted a lot of attention and a lot of followers. In 1963, the Muslim Students Association was also established. And it's interesting because that establishment multiplied the number of venues where people from the Nation of Islam could speak. Because although we did not follow Orthodox Islam, the teaching of Islam that we followed was attractive to people who were in protest. And if you'll notice, in the 60s, people were in protest. So, moving quickly, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz was assassinated in 1965, which ended his career and started the career of Louis Farrakhan, who was his replacement. In 1965, one of the other things that happened is that, 1963, Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay became a Muslim. 1968, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar became a Muslim and supported the Hanafi movement in Washington, D.C., which was bombed. The whole point I'm trying to make is this growth of African American Islam is intricately tied to the growth of Islam as a whole in this country. In 1975, the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, died. His son, Wallace Muhammad, took over and immediately began the conversion of the then Nation of Islam to a purely Sunni organization, so that we are all now just Muslim. And so now you have a huge community of Muslims that are African American, but in the United States, we are a minority because there has been so much immigration. And it's interesting how the immigration has gone. In the early 1900s, most of the immigrants were farmers or laborers. In the 50s, we began to get shop owners and people who knew how to run business. In the 1960s, we got highly educated, qualified people as teachers and students. And today, they want to stop it all. And the reason for that is very simple. America is afraid of Islam. And America is afraid of Islam out of ignorance. You know, one of the interesting things about the Nation of Islam, just as a historical fact, the Nation of Islam was probably the least terroristic or criminal behaving organization that ever existed among black people. You know, in the Nation of Islam, they used to give you a card. If this man violates the law, take the card and send it back to us and put him in jail. Now, why do I mention that? Because, you know, there is, I guess my voice is too loud. There is a conception that the Nation of Islam was a violent organization, and that conception is wrong. And the reason that I want to point that out is because much of our history is a history of mythos or myths rather than reality. And the realities are much simpler. Everyone desires a life of success. And remember what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises the Muslims. The Muslims are the successful ones. He also promises the Muslims, he says, on the believers shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. Now we forget that as Muslims practicing this religion because we supposedly hear it every day and we take it for granted. We take it for granted when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses us, but we don't recognize that it is important that we be grateful every day for every good thing that comes our way. And when we look at the history of all of the oppressed people that come to Islam, the one thing that they share in common is they are thankful. And when we sit here and we practice our religion, I mean, my God, you're going to a beautiful facility that didn't exist 10 years ago, and you don't, every time you walk in the door, go, Alhamdulillah, thank you. Because Allah gave you that. We come into this beautiful building, Alhamdulillah, thank you. Because if we go back to how al-Islam for all of us started in this country, this was unimaginable. And so as we look at African American history and our history as Muslims, we as Muslims are grateful for every step of progress we can make. And we have to be, because we have come so far. You know, as I tell people, when I grew up, my goal in life was to get out of the South. See, I grew up in Tennessee, and I still remember coming home from college and my father telling me, don't tell anybody you're home. I said, why? Or that you're coming home. He said, why? He said, because, you know, the KKK may meet your bus. You're too uppity when you get an education. And this was in the 60s. Today I go home, probably a third of the people in my neighborhood are married to white people. I go into the airports and I see all these old men and old women that I knew at one point would have killed me for no other reason than I was black, chasing brown children. And I look at that and I go, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all powerful. Never, ever doubt what Allah will bless you with. And never have fear that where you are is where you will be. Because Allah changes things. And that's what the history of Muslims in America is a sign of. We have come from the lowest and the weakest to among the most powerful and the most innovative. And Allah did that. And we need to thank Him. So, Assalamu alaikum. I had said I was going to leave time for questions. I didn't. But I do want it to be clear that our African American history is really a part of a greater history of how Islam has grown in this country. And if you have any questions afterwards, I'm available. Assalamu Okay, this is an opinion question, and if I answer it, it is my opinion, it is not God's truth. It is my opinion that we no longer challenge ourselves. We have become complacent. We are able to build masajid. We're able to build schools. We're able to do things. What do we have to fight against anymore? And then we also begin compromising our faith. Because now, well, they ain't treating me bad, so I don't have to fight them. But in that not fighting them, are we doing our prayers, or are we being managed because, well, I'll do my prayers later? You notice how in the workplace, I like to use the example of my Sudanese brothers and sisters in Seattle. We've had Muslims working at the airport in Seattle for decades. It was only when they started to hire the newly immigrated Muslims that they allowed prayer at the airport. So now Muslims are allowed to pray as a part of their job. You know, they're given prayer breaks. Now their lunch hour is reduced, but they're given prayer breaks. Now all of the Muslims that worked there before these people immigrated had never fought for that because they just wanted the job. But the Muslims that came in as new immigrants were fired up that I need to practice my religion like it should be practiced, and they challenged. We've gotten complacent. Yes, sir.
Has anyone succeeded what it did Muhammad? Or the nation now, they are again part of the Sunni Muslim.
It is really a Sunni Muslim community. Imam Warthi Muhammad renamed it several times and finally dissolved it into an association simply because he felt that having a singular leadership weakened our ability to survive. Because when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad died, the wealth of the community was reduced by roughly 90% through taxes and estate issues. And what that meant is all of the properties that the community owned, they lost. The farms they lost, the trucks they lost. All of this was lost because the way the organization was structured, all of this wealth was imputed by the IRS to be the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's personal property. And so they just sued his estate, took everything. And so that's why before he passed, Wallace Muhammad told everybody to form their own corporations, their own organizations, and keep everything independent. And so now every masjid has its own corporate board and corporate structure and own 501c3 status.
The idea of the Black History Month, this is cultural, not Islamic, right?
Yes.
Should it be celebrated by Islam as such?
I refuse to answer.
Okay.
I have that right.
Okay.
Any other questions?
What do you estimate the size of the Black Muslim community in North America now?
Probably about 1 million people.
Only 1 million?
About 1 million. The black community of Muslims has never been as large as the immigrant community, maybe 2 million, but census estimates are that roughly 24% of the population of Muslims are African American Muslims. So if we estimate the whole population at about 8 million, maybe 2 million.
So, Haazim, given the fact that most Christian African Americans are practicing religion that was foisted on their ancestors, is there a resonance or an appeal to African Americans to return back to their roots? And you described your path to Islam, and that was a beautiful story, but is there an appeal just broadly among the African American community about returning to Islam? Because it feels like 1 million out of, I don't know what the African population is, what,
30.
40 million?
Yeah.
It's a very small number. I wonder if you have an opinion or a thought on that.
Let me explain my own family. And I'm not talking about my immediate family, I'm talking about my larger family. There is a fear of Islam because it appears to represent a resistance to the American society. And a lot of people are still afraid to fight America. They want to be considered good American citizens and fully supportive of everything in the American philosophy. And I mean, we as Muslims support America, but we are willing to address America's failings, especially as it comes to the justice and ability to practice our faith that is so often taken from us by crazy people. And so, you know, we address that. They don't want to address that. They want to be considered nice citizens and have their nice life and their nice cars and not have to fight. And to a degree, you know, every Muslim has a daily fight to be Muslim in a society that is not Muslim.
It's like one more fight that they just don't want to.
Nope.
Imam Haazim,
Yes, sir.
a lot of the American Muslims, the black American Muslims, have relatives who are Christians.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So
I do.
that's true for everybody.
Yeah.
So how are the dynamics?
Oh, I'm sorry. I will stop. I'll talk with you individually. Allahu Akbar.